Police officers tie a man to a pole and humiliate him, confident that their act will be without consequences. But their victim turns out to be not what they thought he was, and this meeting will change their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments from where you watched this video. Marcus inhaled deeply as he stepped off the bus, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, heavy with the remnants of his past life. The small town stretched out before him, its quaint charm tainted by an unmistakable sense of isolation. In his mind, Marcus hoped this quiet town would be the place where he could rebuild, start fresh, and find the peace he'd longed for since leaving the military. But as he took in the surroundings, he couldn't shake a feeling of disquiet. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to nerves and the uncertainty of being the new guy. The place had a strange kind of beauty, he had to admit. The narrow, winding streets lined with vintage storefronts, the crooked awnings, and the worn-out facades spoke of a time long past. It was a town preserved in its own bubble, like a memory that refused to fade. But there was something else, too, an unease that seemed to radiate from the cracked bricks and shadowed alleyways, as though the town itself held secrets best left uncovered. As he wandered down Main Street, the stares began. People glanced at him from their windows from across the street, peering at him over their coffee cups in the small corner cafe. He caught their eyes for a moment, but they quickly turned away. It wasn't exactly hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It was as if he were an unwelcome curiosity, a presence they didn't quite know what to make of. Marcus wasn't a man who'd ever felt intimidated by people's stares. He'd seen more than his fair share of conflict, of rough, judgmental gazes that bore into him like a drill. But this was different, more personal. It was the look a tightly knit community might give an outsider they hadn't expected, or invited a kind of quiet rejection. He pushed the thought away, telling himself it was just his own mind playing tricks. After all, he'd just arrived. He entered the local grocery store, a small, dimly lit place filled with narrow aisles packed with dusty shelves. The bell on the door rang as he walked in, drawing the immediate attention of the shopkeeper behind the counter. The man was older, with a face that seemed permanently set in a frown, and he eyed Marcus with an almost weary disinterest. "New around here?" the man asked without looking up from his newspaper, his tone flat and cold. "Yeah," Marcus replied, forcing a small smile. "Just moved in." The shopkeeper gave a slow, assessing nod, as if he were appraising Marcus like he would a piece of spoiled fruit. "Well, welcome, I suppose. Not many new folks come around here." Marcus sensed the implication, the silent question of why he'd chosen this particular town. But instead of explaining, he simply nodded and continued down the aisle. He knew he'd have to tread lightly, at least until people got used to him, if they ever did. A few minutes later, Marcus found himself at the counter, his hands filled with some basic groceries. The shopkeeper barely looked at him as he rang up the items, muttering the total under his breath. Marcus handed him cash, avoiding the man's gaze. The quiet hostility was thick enough to cut with a knife, but he wasn't here to make friends. He just wanted to live his life in peace, to leave the past behind him. As he stepped out of the store, the chill in the air seemed to seep into his bones, and for a brief moment he wondered if he'd made a mistake coming here. But he shook off the thought, reminding himself that he'd left his old life precisely for this, to be alone, to escape from the constant noise and chaos that had consumed him for so long. The next stop on his short list of errands was the small diner he'd spotted from the grocery store window. The smell of fried food and coffee wafted through the air as he stepped inside, and he felt a brief pang of nostalgia. It was the kind of place he'd grown up eating at, a local joint where everyone knew each other, where the waitresses called you on and the coffee was always a little burnt. A few heads turned as he entered, but they quickly went back to their meals, their conversations shifting to a low murmur. He slid into a booth near the back, the leather cracked and worn, the table slightly sticky from years of use. A waitress approached, her face softened with a forced smile. She looked to be in her early 50s, her hair tied up in a messy bun, and her uniform slightly faded. "What'll it be on?" she asked, her tone friendly but reserved. Marcus ordered a coffee and a sandwich, and as she walked away, he caught a glimpse of the subtle suspicion in her eyes. It wasn't overtly hostile, but there was an unmistakable wariness, a certain skepticism that lingered just beneath the surface. He tried not to think about it too much, focusing instead on his meal and the comfort of a warm cup of coffee in his hands. As he ate, he allowed his mind to wander, his thoughts drifting back to the military, to the friends he'd lost, the memories he wished he could erase. He hadn't realized how much he'd been carrying with him until now, sitting alone in this quiet diner, surrounded by people who looked at him as though he were an intruder in their carefully maintained world. Finishing his meal, he stepped back out into the crisp air, feeling both the weight of his memories and the chill of his new surroundings. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in his chest. There was no turning back now. This was his new life, and he'd have to find a way to fit into it. As he walked down the street, his mind continued to wander, the past creeping in around the edges. Faces flashed before him, friends, comrades, moments of camaraderie and despair. The weight of it was almost unbearable at times, but he'd learned to live with it, to bury it deep inside. Yet here in this strange new place, the memories felt sharper, more insistent, as though the quietness of the town somehow amplified them. The soft sound of bells ringing brought him out of his thoughts, and he found himself standing outside a small bookshop. The sign above the door was faded, almost illegible, but something about it drew him in. He pushed the door open, the faint smell of old paper and leather filling his senses as he stepped inside. The shop was small, cramped with shelves overflowing with books, the dim light casting a warm glow over everything. A woman behind the counter looked up as he entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. She looked to be in her 30s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, her expression one of quiet skepticism. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Just looking around," Marcus replied, offering a tentative smile. She nodded, her eyes following him as he wandered through the narrow aisles. The atmosphere was thick with an unspoken tension, and Marcus could feel her watching him, as though she were waiting for him to do something suspicious. It was a feeling he was beginning to get used to, and he wondered if he'd ever be able to move through this town without feeling like he was under constant scrutiny. He picked up a few books, glancing at their covers without really seeing them, his mind still on the past, on the faces that haunted him. He knew he'd have to find a way to move on, to let go of the weight he'd been carrying for so long. But in this strange, isolated town, he wondered if that would ever be possible. Eventually, he left the bookstore, the woman's eyes following him to the door. The sky was beginning to darken, a cold wind picking up as he made his way back to the small apartment he'd rented. It was sparse, barely furnished, but it was his, and for now that was enough. As he settled in for the night, his thoughts drifted back to the people he'd met, the wary looks, the unspoken suspicions. He wondered if he'd ever truly belong here, or if he'd always be an outsider, a stranger in a town that seemed to guard its secrets fiercely. But as he closed his eyes, he told himself that he'd made his choice. The sun barely crested over the horizon as Marcus stepped outside, the cool morning air sharp against his skin. He had planned on taking a quiet walk around town, hoping to see the streets without the scrutiny of so many eyes. The town's early morning stillness offered him a rare opportunity to observe, to feel out his surroundings without the weight of strangers' stares on him. As he walked along Main Street, Marcus allowed himself to relax. The quiet felt peaceful, a momentary respite from the wary glances and whispered conversations that trailed him everywhere. The old buildings were cloaked in the soft glow of dawn, their chipped paint and faded signs taking on a gentler, almost nostalgic beauty in the early light. He stopped for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, feeling, for the first time since his arrival, a sense of calm. But the feeling was short-lived. Ahead, two figures appeared, cutting into his path. Dressed in the unmistakable blue of the local police, the two officers moved with a kind of purpose that instantly put Marcus on edge. Their expressions were cold, their eyes assessing him with a level of disdain that bordered on hostile. Marcus recognized the looks from his years of service. It was the kind of look given to someone who was unwelcome, a target rather than a person. "Morning," one of the officers called out, a mocking lilt in his tone. Marcus nodded, saying nothing, hoping they'd move on. But they didn't. Instead, they stopped in front of him, blocking his path. "Just out for a walk?" the taller officer asked. Marcus noticed the name stitched onto his uniform, Bryant. The other officer, a wiry man with sharp features, stood slightly back, arms crossed, his mouth curved into a smirk. His badge read, Carter. "Yes, just getting to know the town," Marcus replied, keeping his tone even. He'd dealt with people like them before, men who used their authority to intimidate, to remind others who held the power. He knew better than to provoke them, but he also knew that silence could sometimes be more telling than any response. Bryant studied him, his gaze unyielding. "And what brings you to our quiet little town?" "Needed a change of pace," Marcus replied, careful to keep his answer vague. He could feel the tension simmering beneath the officer's gaze, a latent hostility that Marcus sensed had little to do with him personally, and everything to do with the fact that he was an outsider. Carter's smirk widened, and he took a step forward, narrowing the gap between them. "Change of pace, huh? Well, we like things a certain way around here. Don't need anyone coming in and stirring things up." "I don't plan on causing any trouble," Marcus said, his voice steady, though he could feel his patience wearing thin. Bryant raised an eyebrow, his mouth curling into a sneer. "See, that's what they all say. Then, next thing you know, they're getting too comfortable thinking they own the place." His tone was light, almost playful, but Marcus didn't miss the underlying threat. He took a slow, measured breath, forcing himself to stay calm. It was clear these officers had no real reason to question him, but he also knew that challenging them could make his life here far more difficult. He'd been through enough to recognize when he was being baited. Carter leaned in slightly, his eyes gleaming with something close to amusement. "You know, we don't get many strangers here. People like to keep to their own. Makes for fewer misunderstandings." Marcus met his gaze unflinching. "I'm just here to live my life. Don't want any trouble." Bryant let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's what they all say." He clapped Marcus on the shoulder, harder than necessary, a gesture that felt more like a shove than a friendly pat. "Well, don't let us keep you. Just remember, we're always around, keeping an eye on things." Without waiting for a response, the two officers turned and walked away, their voices fading as they moved down the street. Marcus watched them go, feeling a surge of frustration tempered by a lingering unease. He had hoped that staying quiet and minding his own business would allow him to slip under the radar, but it was becoming increasingly clear that his mere presence was enough to disrupt the careful balance of this town. As he continued his walk, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, even after Bryant and Carter had disappeared from view. Every creak of a door, every faint whisper seemed to be directed at him, a reminder that he was an outsider, someone who didn't belong. The town felt different now, less inviting, as though its charm was merely a facade made masking something darker, something that pulsed beneath the surface like a hidden wound. Later that day, as he passed the local hardware store, he overheard a conversation between two men leaning against a truck, their voices low, but carrying an edge that caught his attention. "Yeah, those two are at it again," one of them said, nodding toward the general direction where Marcus had encountered the officers. "Think they'd get tired of running folks off." The other man shrugged, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Guess they figure they're protecting the town, keeping things the way they like 'em." Marcus slowed his steps, pretending to examine a display of gardening tools nearby. The men continued their conversation, unaware that he was listening. "Protecting the town, my ass," the first man muttered. "More like protecting their little kingdom. Don't like anyone who doesn't fit their idea of one of us." The words lingered in Marcus's mind long after he'd walked away. The idea that Bryant and Carter saw the town as their own personal domain, that they were willing to chase out anyone they deemed unworthy, made a knot of anger tighten in his chest. He thought of his past, of the battles he'd fought, the sacrifices he'd made, only to find himself a target of prejudice and disdain in a place he had come to for peace. As the days passed, he found it increasingly difficult to avoid the two officers. They seemed to appear wherever he went, their presence an unspoken reminder that he was being watched, evaluated, judged. Each encounter chipped away at the fragile sense of calm he had tried to build, leaving him feeling more isolated and unwelcome with each passing day. Bryant and Carter didn't need to say much. Their disdain was clear in every look, every smirk, every word laced with condescension. They'd stop him on the street, asking meaningless questions, making thinly veiled comments about how things ought to be in their town. It was a constant barrage of subtle intimidation, designed to remind him of his place, of the fact that, in their eyes, he had no place here at all. Despite his attempts to keep a low profile, rumors about Marcus began to circulate. He'd overhear snippets of conversation, people questioning why he'd come, what his intentions were, speculating about his past. The whispers grew louder, fueled by Bryant and Carter's careful insinuations, their suggestions that Marcus wasn't to be trusted, that he was here to stir up trouble. One evening, after yet another tense encounter with the officers, Marcus returned to his apartment, his mind heavy with anger and frustration. He sat in the dim light, the silence pressing down on him, amplifying his sense of isolation. The memories he'd tried so hard to bury began to resurface: the long nights on patrol, the faces of friends lost, the moments of quiet terror that had etched themselves into his soul. He'd thought he could leave it all behind, that he could find peace in this quiet town. But now, it felt as though he'd merely traded one kind of war for another, a battle he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he could win. The next morning, he noticed Bryant and Carter loitering near his building as he left. They didn't approach him, but their presence was a silent threat, a reminder that they were watching, waiting for any excuse to act. He kept his head down, moving quickly past them, but he could feel their eyes boring into his back, the weight of their judgment like a stone he couldn't shake. As he walked through the town, the oppressive feeling grew stronger, the whispers and sidelong glances more frequent. It was as though the entire town had turned against him, united in their shared mistrust, fueled by the quiet but relentless campaign led by Bryant and Carter. He could feel himself becoming more guarded, his interactions with others strained, his every movement cautious. But despite the isolation, he refused to let them break him. He'd faced worse, he told himself. He'd survived battles that left scars deeper than any sneer or whispered rumor could ever inflict. He would endure, just as he always had. But beneath the determination, a seed of doubt took root, whispering to him in the quiet moments, questioning how long he could withstand the weight of this hidden silent war. The encounters with Bryant and Carter became a twisted routine, an unspoken game of cat and mouse where they toyed with him, testing his patience, pushing his boundaries. Marcus knew they wanted a reaction, that they were waiting for him to slip, to give them a reason to act. And as the days wore on, he could feel the tension building within him, a silent storm he fought to contain, a pressure that threatened to explode with each mocking smirk, each sidelong glance, each reminder that in this town, he would always be an outsider. And as he lay awake at night, the darkness around him thick and suffocating, he wondered how much longer he could hold himself together in the face of a threat that lurked not in gunfire or explosions, but in the quiet, insidious cruelty of those who saw him not as a man, but as an enemy to be driven out. The diner was nearly empty when Marcus walked in, the comforting smell of coffee and fried food filling the air. He had come to see this place as a small refuge, a space where he could briefly disappear from the prying eyes of the town. But today, as he slid into his usual booth, he could sense that something was different. The few patrons in the diner looked up at him with uneasy glances, and he felt their whispers, subtle yet unmistakably directed at him. He tried to shake it off, focusing on the chipped Formica tabletop, the salt and pepper shakers that seemed to have aged with the diner itself. He told himself he'd just have his coffee, maybe a sandwich, and then leave before anyone could make him the center of attention. But as he looked up, he saw them, Bryant and Carter. They sat a few booths down, their uniforms crisp, their expressions dripping with smug satisfaction. Bryant's eyes locked onto his, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, while Carter leaned back with a look of casual ownership. Marcus took a slow, steady breath, trying not to meet their eyes. He didn't want to engage, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing how much their presence unsettled him. But it was too late. Bryant slid out of his booth and walked over, his boots thudding against the diner's tile floor as he approached. "Well, if it isn't our resident drifter," Bryant drawled, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Thought you'd be smart enough to move on by now." Marcus looked up, forcing himself to remain calm. "Just here for a meal," he replied, keeping his tone measured. Carter joined Bryant, leaning against the edge of Marcus's table with a mocking grin. "You know, we don't get many strangers here," he said, his voice laced with fake friendliness. "Guess we like to keep things local." The waitress approached with Marcus's coffee, her hands visibly trembling as she set the cup down. She didn't look at Bryant or Carter, clearly afraid of drawing their ire. Marcus felt a pang of sympathy for her. He knew all too well the fear that people felt around these two. Bryant picked up the coffee cup, inspecting it as if it were some foreign object before casually tipping it over. The hot liquid spilled across the table, splashing onto Marcus's hand, but he didn't flinch. He simply looked up at Bryant, his eyes cold. "Was that necessary?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet but steady. Bryant shrugged, a malicious sparkle in his eye. "Just a little accident. These things happen." Around them, the other patrons turned away, pretending not to notice, each one focused intently on their own meal. Marcus could feel the weight of their silence, the unspoken complicity that left him isolated without an ally. Marcus took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Look, I don't want any trouble. Just trying to have a meal." Carter laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed through the diner. "That's the thing, though. Trouble seems to follow people like you." Marcus felt the frustration rising, but he held it back, knowing that was exactly what they wanted. They were baiting him, pushing him to give them an excuse. He stood up, deciding it was best to leave before things escalated further. But as he turned toward the door, Bryant stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Leaving so soon?" Bryant asked, his voice a low growl. "We were just starting to get to know each other." Marcus held his gaze, his fists clenched at his sides. "Move," he said quietly, his voice steady and controlled. Bryant raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh, is that an order, soldier? Hate to break it to you, but around here, you're not the one giving the orders." Without warning, Bryant's hand shot out, shoving Marcus hard in the chest. Marcus stumbled back, hitting the edge of the booth behind him. He saw the waitress glance over, her face a mask of fear, but she quickly looked away, unwilling to intervene. Carter stepped closer, his smirk widening. "You're in our town now. Best you remember that." Marcus felt the tension building inside him, his patience wearing dangerously thin. He couldn't afford to lose control, not here, not in front of these people who seemed eager to see him humiliated. He tried to brush past them again, but they followed him outside, their laughter echoing behind him. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he realized too late that he'd walked straight into their trap. Bryant grabbed him roughly by the arm, spinning him around to face them. "Where do you think you're going?" Bryant sneered, his grip tightening. "We're not done with you yet." Marcus clenched his jaw, his voice low. "Get your hands off me." Carter chuckled, circling around him like a predator sizing up its prey. "Big tough guy, aren't you? All alone here, thinking you're something special." Marcus tried to pull away, but Bryant tightened his grip, leaning in close. "You don't belong here," he hissed, his voice filled with quiet malice. "People like you, we don't need them around." The insinuation was clear, and Marcus felt a cold rage settle in his chest. He'd faced prejudice before, but there was something particularly cruel, almost sadistic, in Bryant and Carter's eyes. They weren't just trying to intimidate him, they wanted to break him. Before he could react, Bryant and Carter shoved him against a nearby streetlight pole. Carter took out a pair of handcuffs, snapping them onto Marcus's wrists, binding him tightly to the pole in a twisted display of authority. "This is just a little reminder," Bryant whispered, his tone dripping with disdain. "You don't belong here." Marcus struggled against the cuffs, but his efforts were futile. He felt the cold metal biting into his wrists, felt the helplessness settling in, as the reality of his situation became clear. He was trapped, humiliated, and utterly powerless. But then, Bryant stepped back, his face twisted with a smirk that sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Without a word, he moved closer, unzipping his pants, and before Marcus could fully process what was happening, Bryant began to relieve himself on him. The hot stream hit Marcus's leg, then soaked into his clothes, filling his nostrils with the pungent stench. Marcus closed his eyes, every muscle in his body taut with a mixture of fury and shame. He could hear snickers from a few bystanders who had gathered to watch, the whispers and gasps as they took in the degrading spectacle. Through the humiliation, he could feel the familiar, simmering anger stirring within him, the same anger he'd tried so hard to bury. But he was powerless to do anything, chained to the pole like an animal, exposed to the judgmental stares of strangers. Finally, Bryant and Carter stepped back, their laughter ringing in his ears as they left him standing there, drenched and humiliated. They didn't bother to unlock the cuffs, leaving him bound to the pole as they walked away, their voices fading into the distance. Some of the onlookers had their phones out, recording the incident, but no one moved to help. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, felt the weight of their silent judgment, their complicity in his humiliation. After what felt like an eternity, a young woman approached, her face filled with pity and shame, as she pulled a small key from her pocket. Without a word, she unlocked the cuffs, freeing him. Marcus muttered a quiet thank you, though the words felt hollow, stripped of any real meaning. As he stumbled away from the pole, he could feel the shame and anger seething within him, a toxic mixture that left him feeling raw and exposed. This wasn't just an act of cruelty, it was a calculated attempt to strip him of his dignity, to make him feel as though he was nothing. By the time he made it back to his apartment, he was trembling, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. The humiliation, the utter disregard for his humanity, it was a wound that went deeper than any physical injury, a reminder of his isolation in a town that wanted nothing more than to see him broken. But even in his despair, a spark of defiance remained. They wanted to drive him out, to make him believe he was powerless. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. He'd survived worse, he reminded himself. He wasn't going to let a couple of sadistic officers define his life. In that moment, he knew he couldn't remain silent. The morning light filtered through the blinds in Marcus's apartment, casting long shadows across the floor. He woke to an unexpected buzz. His phone, which had been silent for days, was suddenly filled with notifications. He squinted at the screen, groggy from a restless night, but as he registered what he was seeing, a sinking feeling settled in his stomach. The video. He clicked on the first notification, which led him to a post on social media. A shaky, low-quality video of his encounter with Bryant and Carter in the diner and his public humiliation on the street had gone viral overnight. Comments flooded the screen, an outpouring of anger, shock, and disgust at the behavior of the officers. People were horrified by the abuse, by the smug arrogance of the officers as they restrained him and left him to be mocked in the middle of town. Marcus's initial reaction was a mixture of humiliation and dread. He hadn't wanted attention, hadn't wanted his life, his pain to be on display for the world to dissect. But as he scrolled through the endless stream of comments, his shame began to be tempered by something else, something unfamiliar but strangely comforting. Strangers from around the country were outraged on his behalf, demanding justice, calling for accountability. People were sharing his story, reposting the video, spreading it across the internet. There was no going back now. The town's secret was out. Within hours, the media had descended on the town. News vans lined the streets, reporters gathered at the local diner, at the grocery store, even outside the police station. Journalists with cameras and microphones waited, hoping for a statement from someone in authority, but the town officials remained silent, unwilling to confront the growing storm. Marcus watched from his window as the quiet, insular town he'd come to know was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. He could see groups of people gathering outside, some waving signs that read "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Abuse." A mixture of locals and outsiders filled the streets, the tension simmering as people voiced their outrage, their demands for change. For Marcus, it was a surreal experience. He'd come here seeking peace, anonymity, a quiet place to live out his days in solitude. But now his face was plastered across television screens, his story shared by news anchors and bloggers alike. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this kind of attention, wasn't sure if he wanted it. But he couldn't ignore the impact it was having, the way people, complete strangers, had rallied to his side, their voices loud and unwavering. That afternoon, a soft knock at his door broke through his thoughts. He opened it to find a young woman standing there, her face familiar from the diner. She was the waitress who had served him that day, the one who had looked away as Bryant and Carter taunted him. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something that looked like remorse. "Marcus, right?" she asked, her voice tentative. He nodded, unsure of what to expect. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice wavering. "I saw what they did to you. I should have done something, but I was scared. I didn't think they'd go that far." Marcus nodded, appreciating her honesty. He knew she was as much a victim of their intimidation as he had been. "I don't blame you," he said quietly. "This town, it's a hard place to stand up in." She glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. "They've been doing this for years. Anyone who's not one of us, they don't get to stay for long. Bryant and Carter, they think they own this place." But now, she looked down at her phone, where the video was still playing, paused on the image of Marcus bound to the pole, surrounded by onlookers. Now everyone knows. Marcus's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The waitress's words confirmed what he'd suspected. This wasn't just about him. Bryant and Carter had built a legacy of fear, a culture of silence and obedience that the town had learned to live with. But the video had changed everything. For the first time, their actions had been exposed to the world, laid bare for all to see. The waitress left, leaving Marcus with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he couldn't hide from this, couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. People were watching, waiting to see what he would do next. And for the first time since his arrival, he felt a surge of determination, a desire to fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, to feel powerless. That evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his voice wary. "Hello? Mr. Hayes?" The voice on the other end was firm, professional. "This is Daniel Reed from Channel 8 News. I'd like to interview you about your experiences in the town, if you're willing. The video has drawn national attention, and people want to hear your side of the story." Marcus was silent for a moment, the weight of the offer settling over him. He'd never been one to seek the spotlight, but now, with the world watching, he felt a strange sense of responsibility. He could see the faces of the people who had watched him suffer, the silent onlookers who had turned away as Bryant and Carter humiliated him. He could be their voice, the voice for those who couldn't speak up for themselves. "All right," he replied, his voice steady. "I'll do it." The next day, Marcus found himself standing in front of a crowd, a microphone in his hand, the bright lights of the news cameras blinding him. Reporters, activists, and concerned citizens had gathered in the town square, their voices a chorus of outrage and support. He could feel their eyes on him, their anticipation palpable. The weight of their expectations pressed down on him, but he steadied himself, determined to make his story count. He took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces before him. The words came slowly at first, hesitant, but as he spoke, they gained strength, each one carrying the weight of his pain, his frustration, his hope. "I came to this town looking for peace," he began, his voice low but steady. "I wanted a fresh start, a place to leave my past behind. But what I found here was something I thought I'd left behind a long time ago, a world where people are judged by the way they look, where fear and intimidation rule, where some people think they're above the law." The crowd was silent, their attention rapt, hanging on his every word. "They tried to make me feel small," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "They tried to humiliate me, to drive me out. But I'm not leaving. And I'm not staying silent." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and he felt a surge of energy, a sense of solidarity he hadn't expected. People were listening, really listening. He glanced at the reporters, their cameras trained on him, capturing every word, every expression. This moment was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong. As he spoke, he could see the effect his words were having on the townspeople. Some of them looked away, their faces flushed with shame, while others nodded, their expressions filled with a mix of anger and empathy. He could see the division within the crowd, the tension between those who supported him and those who still clung to the old ways, who believed Bryant and Carter's actions were justified. He addressed them directly, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "This isn't just about me. It's about the kind of town we want to be. Do we want to live in fear? Do we want to let a few people decide who's welcome and who isn't? Or do we want to stand up together and make this a place where everyone is treated with respect?" The applause was thunderous, echoing through the square as people cheered, their voices raised in support. Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of liberation he hadn't felt in years. For the first time, he felt like he had a purpose beyond survival, a mission that transcended his own struggles. As he stepped down from the podium, a group of young people approached him, their faces filled with admiration and determination. They introduced themselves as members of a grassroots organization dedicated to fighting injustice and bringing about change. They'd come to the town after seeing the video, drawn by the chance to make a difference, to stand up against the kind of oppression that Bryant and Carter represented. "We want to help," one of them said, a young woman with fierce eyes and a defiant spirit. "This town needs change, and we're here to make sure it happens." In that moment, Marcus realized he wasn't alone. He had allies, people who shared his vision for a better world, a world where people were judged not by their appearance or their background, but by the content of their character. He felt a sense of hope, a glimmer of possibility that maybe, just maybe, this town could become the place he dreamed of, a place of acceptance, of justice, of peace. The media coverage intensified in the following days, and the pressure on the local authorities became impossible to ignore. The town's officials, who had initially tried to downplay the incident, were forced to confront the reality of their officers' actions. Calls for an investigation grew louder, and the town's police chief reluctantly announced that Bryant and Carter would be suspended pending an inquiry. The townspeople, too, began to question the status quo. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening openly, as people discussed the need for accountability, for a new way forward. Marcus could feel the town shifting, the foundations of its old ways beginning to crack. He knew there was still a long road ahead, that true change wouldn't come overnight. But as he looked around at the people who had gathered to support him, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He'd come here searching for peace, and while he hadn't found it in the way he'd expected, he'd found something even more valuable: a community willing to stand up for what was right, to fight for a future free from fear and oppression. As he walked back to his apartment that night, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the shadows of his past finally beginning to fade. He was no longer just a stranger in this town. He was part of something bigger, a movement that would change the town forever. And for the first time he felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that he'd finally found his place not just in this town, but in a cause worth fighting for. Marcus hadn't slept much in days. Ever since his story had gone viral, he'd been thrust into the whirlwind of public attention, media interviews, and meetings with activists and reporters who had flooded into town to cover the events. The unexpected support from strangers gave him strength, but he felt like he was living in a dream, watching his own life unfold from a distance. On a gray, overcast morning, Marcus found himself standing in front of a makeshift podium set up in the town's central square. A crowd had gathered, larger than anything the town had ever seen: locals, reporters, activists, and people from neighboring areas who had heard about his story and had come to show their support. The atmosphere was electric, filled with an energy Marcus hadn't felt in years. As he looked out at the crowd, a familiar anxiety stirred within him. Speaking out wasn't something he was used to. He'd spent most of his life avoiding attention, keeping his thoughts and feelings to himself. But now, with hundreds of eyes trained on him, he knew he couldn't stay silent. These people were here for him, but more importantly, they were here for the cause he now represented: the fight against the injustice and intimidation that had festered in this town for far too long. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as he gripped the edges of the podium. His mind raced through everything he wanted to say, all the thoughts and feelings that had built up over the past few weeks. But as he began to speak, the words came naturally, flowing from a place deep within him. "I came to this town hoping to find peace," he began, his voice carrying across the square. "I thought I could escape my past, leave behind the battles I'd fought and the pain I'd endured. But what I found here was something I didn't expect: a town ruled by fear, by prejudice, by people who believe they're above the law." The crowd was silent, their attention rapt as he continued. "They tried to break me," he said, his voice growing stronger. "They tried to humiliate me, to make me feel small, like I didn't belong. But what they didn't realize is that I've been through worse. I've faced things they can't even imagine, and I'm still here. I'm still standing." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and he felt a surge of confidence, a sense of purpose that propelled him forward. "I know I'm not the first to face this kind of treatment. I know there are others out there who have been silenced, who have been made to feel like they don't matter. But I'm here to say that we do matter. Our voices matter, and we will not be silenced." A roar of applause erupted, filling the square with a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. Marcus felt a wave of emotion wash over him, the weight of his words settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew he was speaking for more than just himself. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been made to feel like an outsider, for everyone who had ever been oppressed or marginalized. He took a moment to collect himself before continuing, his voice steadier now, filled with a quiet determination. "This isn't just about me," he said, looking out at the faces in the crowd. "It's about all of us. It's about what kind of town we want to be, what kind of people we want to be. Do we want to live in fear? Do we want to let a few people dictate who's welcome here and who isn't? Or do we want to stand together to create a place where everyone is treated with respect, with dignity?" The crowd erupted again, their cheers and applause a testament to the power of his words. Marcus could see the faces of the townspeople, some filled with shame, others with pride, and still others with a newfound resolve. He realized that this was more than just a speech. It was a call to action, a plea for change that resonated deeply with everyone who had ever felt the weight of oppression. As the applause died down, he spoke again, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "I'm just one man. I can't do this alone. But together we can make a difference. We can stand up to those who would keep us down, to those who would silence us. We can build a town that we're all proud to call home." He stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. People surged forward, their hands reaching out to him, their voices filled with gratitude and admiration. He felt a sense of unity, a connection to these people that went beyond words. For the first time since he'd arrived in this town, he felt like he was truly part of something bigger than himself. As he made his way through the crowd, he noticed a group of young people holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "End Police Corruption." They looked at him with a mixture of admiration and determination, their faces filled with the fire of youth, the conviction that they could change the world. One of them, a young woman with fierce eyes and a determined expression, stepped forward. "We're with you, Marcus," she said, her voice filled with passion. "We want to help. This town needs change, and we're here to make sure it happens." Marcus felt a swell of pride as he looked at them. He could see himself in their faces, the same desire for justice, the same refusal to accept the status quo. He realized that he wasn't alone in this fight, that there were others who shared his vision, who were willing to stand up for what was right. In the days that followed, the town was transformed. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening openly, as people spoke out against the culture of fear and intimidation that had plagued the town for so long. The media coverage intensified, shining a spotlight on the town's history of abuse and corruption, and the pressure on the local authorities grew impossible to ignore. The police chief, who had initially tried to downplay the incident, was forced to confront the growing outrage. Under pressure from the public and the media, he announced that Bryant and Carter would be suspended pending an investigation. It was a small victory, but it was a step in the right direction, a sign that change was possible. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to speak out, his voice a rallying cry for those who had been silenced. He attended town meetings, spoke to local organizations, and met with activists who had come from across the state to support him. His story had become a symbol of resistance, a testament to the power of standing up against injustice, and he was determined to make the most of it. He found himself becoming more involved in the community, building relationships with people he'd once viewed as strangers. He met with local business owners, church leaders, and community organizers, discussing ways to address the issues that had been brought to light. Together, they worked to develop programs aimed at fostering understanding, at breaking down the barriers that had divided the town for so long. One evening, as he was leaving a community meeting, he was approached by an older man, his face lined with age and experience. The man extended a hand, his grip firm and steady. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said, his voice filled with emotion. "I've lived in this town my whole life, and I never thought I'd see the day when someone would stand up to those two. What you're doing, it's giving people hope." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat, and he nodded, grateful for the man's words. He knew that this fight was far from over, that there were still obstacles to overcome, but moments like these reminded him of why he was doing this, of the lives he was touching, the change he was helping to bring about. As he walked home that night, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, the experiences that had shaped him, the battles he'd fought both on and off the field. He realized that everything he'd been through had led him to this moment, that his pain and his struggles had given him the strength to stand up, to fight for what was right. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, a sense that he was exactly where he was meant to be. He knew there would be challenges ahead, that the road to change was long and difficult, but he was ready to face it, armed with the knowledge that he was no longer alone. The town had a long way to go, but Marcus could see the beginnings of a brighter future, a future where everyone was treated with respect and dignity, where fear and prejudice no longer held sway. And as he looked out over the quiet streets, he knew that he would do everything in his power to make that future a reality. He was no longer just a man seeking peace. He was a voice for change, a beacon of hope for a town that was finally ready to confront its past and build a better future. And as he stood there, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights, he knew that he had found something he hadn't even realized. He was looking for a place where he belonged. The morning sunlight streamed through Marcus's apartment window, painting the room in a warm golden hue. For the first time since he'd arrived in this town, he felt a deep sense of calm. The tension, the fear, and the anxiety that had haunted him were beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet but powerful determination. Today marked a turning point not just for him, but for the town that had, however unwillingly, become his home. In the days since his public speech, the atmosphere in town had shifted dramatically. The once quiet streets were alive with conversation, people talking openly about things they'd been too afraid to discuss before. Marcus could feel the change in the air. It was subtle, but unmistakable. There was a new sense of purpose among the townspeople, a collective desire to move forward and make things right. One of the most significant developments had come just a few days prior. Under the relentless pressure from both the media and the townspeople, Bryant and Carter had been formally charged and taken into custody. The news had spread like wildfire, bringing a wave of relief and vindication to those who had suffered in silence for so long. Marcus could hardly believe it when he'd heard the two officers who had tormented him were finally being held accountable for their actions. But it wasn't just Bryant and Carter who were facing consequences. The entire police department was undergoing a thorough investigation, led by an independent team brought in from the state capitol. Rumors circulated that several other officers might be implicated, and the town's police chief had already submitted his resignation, citing personal reasons. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of justice. The old guard was finally crumbling, and with it, the culture of fear that had ruled the town for so many years. With the leadership in flux, a temporary oversight committee was established, comprised of community members, legal experts, and representatives from various civil rights organizations. Marcus was invited to join, not only as a symbol of the change he had sparked but as an advocate for lasting reforms. Although he hesitated at first, wary of being thrust further into the spotlight, he knew that his presence could help ensure that the changes weren't merely superficial. Sitting in the first committee meeting, Marcus listened as the other members discussed their plans. They spoke of policies and training programs designed to prevent abuses of power, of community outreach initiatives to rebuild trust between the police and the public. They even discussed the possibility of implementing body cameras for all officers, a measure Marcus knew would be a powerful tool for transparency. For the first time, he felt that his experiences, his suffering, were being channeled into something meaningful. During the meeting, an older woman seated across from him raised her hand to speak. She was a retired teacher, her face lined with wisdom and compassion. "We need to go beyond just punishing the guilty," she said, her voice strong but gentle. "We need to educate the young, to teach them about respect, about equality. It starts with the next generation." Her words resonated deeply with Marcus. He remembered his own upbringing, the lessons his parents had instilled in him about fairness, integrity, and compassion. The idea of reaching the town's youth, of helping them understand the importance of empathy and justice, struck a chord within him. He realized that real change wouldn't come from a single protest or a few policy changes. It would come from reshaping the town's values, from inspiring its future leaders. After the meeting, he approached the woman, introducing himself. They spoke for a while about the town, about the challenges it faced, and eventually, the conversation turned to the idea of an educational program, a series of workshops and classes designed to teach children about social justice, about the importance of standing up against prejudice. The idea began to take shape, and by the time they parted ways, Marcus had already made plans to meet with local educators and community leaders to discuss how they could bring this vision to life. As the days passed, Marcus found himself more deeply involved in the community than he'd ever expected. He met with teachers, parents, and volunteers, helping to establish the framework for the educational program. They planned interactive lessons, discussions, and events where children could learn about empathy, fairness, and the dangers of prejudice. The initiative quickly gained support, with people from all walks of life stepping up to contribute their time and resources. One afternoon, Marcus visited a local elementary school to speak with a group of students about his experiences. As he stood in front of the young faces, he felt a swell of emotion. These children were the future of the town, the ones who would carry its legacy forward. He spoke to them honestly, sharing his story in simple terms they could understand, hoping that his words would inspire them to be kind, to be brave, to stand up for what was right. The response was overwhelming. The children listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity and empathy. Some of them even raised their hands, asking questions, wanting to know more about what they could do to make a difference. Marcus felt a profound sense of hope as he looked at them, realizing that they were the embodiment of the town's new beginning, a generation unburdened by the prejudices of the past, ready to forge a better future. Meanwhile, the town itself continued to evolve. Businesses that had once turned a blind eye to the injustices around them began to take a stand, supporting local initiatives and sponsoring events aimed at promoting unity. Churches held discussions about tolerance and compassion, encouraging their congregations to embrace these values. Even the local newspaper, which had previously shied away from controversial topics, published a series of articles on social justice and the importance of community solidarity. The changes extended to the police department as well. New officers were brought in, carefully selected for their commitment to integrity and fairness. Training programs were implemented, focusing on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and the ethical responsibilities of law enforcement. The department's leadership emphasized transparency and accountability, vowing to earn back the trust of the community they served. As Marcus walked through the town one evening, he marveled at the transformation that had taken place. The buildings were the same, the streets as familiar as ever, but the atmosphere was different. People greeted him with warmth, with genuine smiles and words of gratitude. They spoke openly about the town's journey, about the work that still needed to be done, but there was a sense of optimism, of collective determination that hadn't been there before. In his heart, Marcus knew that this wasn't the end of the journey. There would still be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But he also knew that the foundation had been laid, that the town had taken its first steps toward healing. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. On a quiet morning a few weeks later, he stood outside his apartment, looking out at the town he had once viewed with trepidation and mistrust. It was still rough around the edges, still grappling with its history, but it was a town in the process of healing, of becoming a place where people could live without fear, without prejudice. As he stood there, he thought about the journey that had brought him here, the struggles, the moments of pain and doubt, the countless times he had wanted to give up. But he had persevered, and in doing so, he had found not only his own strength but a sense of belonging, a purpose that went beyond himself. A gentle breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of fresh rain, and Marcus closed his eyes, letting the calmness wash over him. He knew that he would stay, that this town was now his home, not because of the buildings or the streets, but because of the people, the community that had come together in the face of adversity. With a final glance at the town, he turned and walked toward the square, where a new plaque had been erected, a simple, elegant marker inscribed with the words justice and unity. It was a symbol of the town's journey, a reminder of the fight they had all endured and the future they were building together. As he stood before the plaque, a few townspeople gathered around him, their faces familiar, their expressions warm and welcoming. They spoke quietly, sharing stories of the changes they had seen, the progress they had made. Marcus listened, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction, a quiet pride that he had played a part in this transformation. In that moment, he realized that his journey had come full circle. He had arrived in this town seeking peace, a place to lay his burdens down. And while he hadn't found peace in the way he'd expected, he had found something far more valuable, a sense of purpose, a community, and a home where he truly belonged. As he left the square and walked back through the town, he felt a lightness in his step, a freedom he hadn't felt in years. The shadows of his past had lifted, replaced by the bright promise of the future. And for the first time, he knew, without a doubt, that he was exactly where he was meant to be, Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. Leave comments and share what you think. We look forward to seeing you on the next video. See you very soon.